By the winter of 1944, the German Wehrmacht was a starving, ragged shadow of the army that had conquered Europe 4 years earlier. On the Western Front, huddled in freezing foxholes in the Ardennes or the muddy forests of the Hurtgenwald, the average German lancer, the common infantryman, was living on borrowed time and practically 0 calories. Their uniforms were threadbare, their ammunition pouches were often empty, and their stomachs had been growling for months. The glorious rations of the early Blitzkrieg years, the heavy sausages, the dense pumpernickel bread, the real coffee were distant memories. Now, they survived on ersatz, everything. Coffee made from roasted acorns, bread stretched with sawdust, and watered-down soup that tasted mostly of despair. But hunger wasn't the only thing gnawing at their resolve. There was also fear, a specific, carefully cultivated fear, planted deep in their minds by Joseph Goebbels and the Nazi propaganda machine. For years, German soldiers had been told horrific tales of what awaited them if they ever surrendered to the Allies. The propaganda posters plastered on the walls of bombed-out German cities were explicit. They depicted American soldiers as Chicago-style gangsters, gum-chewing barbarians with no culture and a thirst for violence. They were told that the Americans were merely the vanguard for the Bolshevik hordes in the East, and that captivity under either meant the same thing, a slow, agonizing death. The rumors whispered along the trench lines were terrifying. Surrender meant immediate execution in a roadside ditch. It meant being shipped to the freezing gulags of Siberia to be worked to death in salt mines. It meant starvation camps where men would turn to cannibalism to survive. The Nazi leadership knew that fear was a potent motivator, perhaps the only motivator left for a crumbling army. They needed their soldiers to believe that fighting to the death was literally their only option. The logic was simple. It is better to die on your feet with a rifle in your hand than to rot in an Allied cage. And so, when the end finally came for hundreds of thousands of German soldiers in the final months of the war, when the ammunition finally ran out, or the unit was completely surrounded by Sherman tanks, the moment of surrender was terrifying. Hands trembled as they went up in the air. Cries of "Kamerad" were choked with the expectation of a rifle butt to the face or a bullet. The initial experience of capture in Europe seemed to confirm their worst fears. The sheer volume of prisoners taken in late 1944 and early 1945 overwhelmed the Allied logistical system. The Germans were herded into vast, open-air holding pens in France and Belgium, known cynically as Rhine meadow camps. These were muddy fields, surrounded by barbed wire, with no shelter from the freezing rain, and barely enough food to keep them alive. Men slept in holes they dug in the mud with their bare hands. Disease was rampant. Looking around at these miserable conditions, many German prisoners thought, Goebbels was right. This is the beginning of the end. We are going to die here. But these camps were just holding areas. The Allies had a problem. What to do with nearly 400,000 prisoners of war? Europe was shattered. There was no food, no housing, and the transport infrastructure was destroyed. They couldn't keep them there. The solution was radical: ship them across the Atlantic. The journey began at ports like Le Havre or Cherbourg. The prisoners were loaded onto Liberty ships, the mass-produced cargo vessels that were the workhorses of the Allied supply chain. For many of the young German conscripts, boys from rural Bavaria or Prussia who had never seen the ocean, the sight of the vast Atlantic was terrifying enough. They were crammed into the holds of these ships, tier upon tier of canvas bunks stacked floor to ceiling. The air was thick with the smell of diesel fumes, unwashed bodies, and seasickness. The crossing took weeks, zigzagging across the ocean to avoid the few remaining U-boats, a grim irony that they might be torpedoed by their own side. Yet, it was in the bowels of these Liberty ships that the cracks in the Nazi propaganda began to appear. It started with something as simple as white bread. A German prisoner, perhaps an 18-year-old who had known nothing but rationing and war since childhood, would be handed his meal in the galley. He would look down at the tray. There was bread. Not the black, dense, sour Kommissbrot he was used to, which was often hard enough to break a tooth. This bread was shockingly white, soft as a cloud, and tasted almost sweet. And there was butter real, yellow, fatty butter, not margarine stretched with water. There was coffee that actually smelled like coffee beans. They ate nervously, looking over their shoulders, waiting for the trick. Was this the last meal before the execution? Why waste such precious resources on the enemy? The hardened Nazis among the prisoners whispered that it was a psychological ploy, an attempt to soften them up for interrogation. But as the days went on and the meals continued to arrive, stews thick with actual meat, canned fruits, endless supplies of cigarettes, the confusion grew. Then came the arrival in America. After weeks at sea, the Liberty ships pulled into harbors in Boston, New York, or Newport News. The prisoners were brought up on deck. What they saw silenced them. They had just come from a continent where every major city was a charred skeleton of rubble. Berlin, Hamburg, Cologne. They were landscapes of ruin, smelling of ash and death, where the lights never turned on at night for fear of bombers. Now, they looked out at American coastal cities that were pristine. Skyscrapers glimmered in the sun, completely untouched by war. At night, the cities were ablaze with light, a dazzling display of electricity that seemed unimaginably wasteful to eyes accustomed to blackouts. The ports were beehives of activity, not with the frantic desperation of a collapsing Reich, but with the smooth, mechanized power of an industrial giant operating at full capacity. They were marched off the ships, past docks groaning with crates of supplies destined for Europe. They saw workers who looked healthy and well-fed. They saw cars driving on the streets, civilian cars, burning gasoline that wasn't desperately needed at the front. The sheer scale of the abundance was staggering. It was the first real physical proof of the lie they had been told. Germany was not fighting a decadent, weak nation on the verge of collapse. They were fighting a nation of unimaginable wealth and power. The prisoners were loaded onto trains for the final leg of their journey. The shades on the windows were left up. This, too, was a psychological weapon, though the Americans didn't necessarily plan it that way. As the trains rolled west, deep into the American heartland, the German soldiers sat, glued to the windows. They traveled for days. They crossed states that were larger than entire European countries. They saw endless miles of farmland, corn, and wheat stretching to the horizon, unscarred by tank tracks or artillery craters. They saw herds of fat cattle grazing in pastures. They saw towns with neat white houses and paved roads. The vastness of the country was overwhelming. They realized, with a sinking feeling in their guts, the geographical impossibility of Germany ever defeating a nation with this much land and these many resources. "We were told America was a paper tiger," one prisoner later recalled. "But looking out that train window, I realized we had been fighting a grizzly bear with a penknife." Finally, the train slowed and pulled into sidings in places that sounded exotic and alien to German ears. Aliceville, Alabama; Concordia, Kansas; Hearne, Texas. There were over 700 main POW camps scattered across the United States, mostly in the South and Southwest, where the weather was warm and heating costs were low. The prisoners disembarked, stiff and anxious, clutching their meager possessions. They looked up and saw the familiar architecture of confinement. Tall fences topped with glistening barbed wire, guard towers with machine guns manned by American MPs, bright searchlights sweeping the perimeter. This is it, many thought. The American Gulag. The brief respite of the ship journey and the train ride was over. Now the real punishment would begin. The propaganda posters of starving men behind wire flashed in their minds. They formed up in ranks, awaiting the shouted orders, the beatings, the humiliation. Instead, they were processed with a strange, bureaucratic efficiency. They were deloused, showered, and given medical exams by doctors who actually had medicine. Their tattered Wehrmacht uniforms, often crawling with lice, were taken away to be fumigated. In their place, they were issued American Army surplus clothing, denim work shirts, and trousers. On the back of the shirts and the legs of the pants, large bold letters were stenciled: PW, prisoner of war. They were marched to their barracks. These weren't holes in the ground or drafty tents. They were standard U.S. Army wooden barracks, identical to the ones American GI trainees slept in. There were pot-bellied stoves for heat. There were actual cots with mattresses and clean blankets. There were indoor latrines with running water. The Germans looked around in disbelief. This prison was better than many of the barracks they had lived in as soldiers of the Reich, even before the war turned sour. But the true shock, the moment that would fundamentally break the worldview of thousands of these men, came when the dinner bell rang on that first evening. They lined up outside the mess hall, mess kits in hand, expecting the universal gruel of the prisoner, a thin cabbage soup perhaps, or a piece of hardtack. They shuffled forward, the smell wafting from the open doors growing stronger. It didn't smell like cabbage. It smelled savory, rich and fatty. They entered the mess hall. It was clean, bright, and loud, with the clatter of trays. They moved along the serving line, and their eyes widened. American Army cooks, sleeves rolled up, were standing behind enormous metal steam trays loaded with food. And not just food, meat. For a German soldier in 1945, meat was a rumor. A piece of tough horsemeat sausage once a week was a luxury. Here, they were looking at piles of fried chicken, thick slabs of meatloaf, or giant mounds of ground beef cooked into chili. There were potatoes not rotten, frozen ones scrounged from a field, but mountains of mashed potatoes swimming in brown gravy. There were bowls of bright green peas, carrots, and corn. The German prisoners held out their trays, their hands shaking slightly. The American cooks didn't carefully measure out a meager ration. With a casual, almost bored flick of the wrist, they slapped huge, generous scoops of food onto the metal trays. The pile grew higher. Meat, potatoes, vegetables, thick slices of white bread, pats of butter. The prisoners stared at the mountain of food. It was more than they would eat in 3 days on the Eastern Front. They looked at the guards, expecting them to laugh and snatch it away. But the guards just gestured for them to move along. They sat down at the long wooden tables, stunned into silence. The only sound was the scraping of forks on metal trays. They ate ravenously, shoveling the food into their mouths, terrified it might disappear. The flavors were overwhelming: the salt, the fat, the sheer caloric density of it hit their starving systems like a drug. And then, just when they thought it couldn't get any more surreal, the cooks brought out dessert. It was ice cream. In the middle of a global war, with rationing in effect across the world, the United States Army was serving its prisoners of war vanilla ice cream. For the men sitting in that mess hall, spoons hovering halfway to their mouths, this was the moment the psychological dam finally broke. To a German soldier, ice cream was a memory from a different lifetime, a luxury that belonged to the pre-war years of peace. To see it here, served in a prison camp, was a demonstration of logistical superiority that shattered their morale more effectively than any artillery barrage. It screamed of a nation with so much surplus capacity that it could afford to waste sugar and dairy on the enemy. One prisoner later wrote in his diary, "I knew then that we were beaten. A country that can give ice cream to its prisoners is a country that cannot be defeated." This surreal abundance became the defining feature of their captivity. The German prisoners nicknamed their new homes the Fritz Ritz. The camps, scattered across the American hinterland, operated under a strict interpretation of the Geneva Convention. The United States, worried about the treatment of its own boys in German stalags, decided to follow the rules to the letter, hoping the Germans would reciprocate. This meant the prisoners received the same caloric intake as an active-duty American GI, roughly 4,000 calories a day. For men coming from the starvation rations of the Wehrmacht, this was an overwhelming amount of food. In the first few weeks, camp infirmaries were full of men suffering from severe indigestion, simply because their shrunken stomachs couldn't handle the rich, fatty American diet. They gained weight rapidly. The hollow cheeks filled out. The gray pallor of the front lines was replaced by the tan of the American sun. But the Americans offered more than just calories. They offered a strange, regulated kind of freedom. Boredom was the enemy of discipline, so the camp commanders encouraged sports. Soccer was, predictably, the obsession of the German inmates. They leveled playing fields, sewed uniforms out of dyed rags, and organized camp leagues with relegation and promotion systems that rivaled the Bundesliga. But the Americans, in a spirit of cultural exchange, introduced them to baseball. It was a comical clash of cultures. The guards would stand by the wire, shouting instructions as the Germans tried to make sense of the diamond, the innings, and the strange, non-linear flow of the game. Many prisoners took to it with surprising enthusiasm, finding in the statistics and the precise rules of baseball something that appealed to their orderly sensibilities. On Sunday afternoons, in camps in Texas or Oklahoma, you could see the bizarre spectacle of Wehrmacht soldiers, stripped to the waist in the heat, swinging bats and running bases while American MPs cheered them on. It was a scene of idyllic Americana, populated by the soldiers of the Third Reich. The camps became functioning cities within cities. The prisoners were paid for their labor 80 cents a day in camp scrip, which was a small fortune compared to their army pay. They spent this money at the camp canteen, the PX. Here, they could buy things that had been unavailable in Germany for years: chocolate, razor blades, Coca-Cola, and beer. Yes, beer. The idea that a prisoner of war could finish a day's work and buy a cold beer was so alien to the German concept of prison that many wrote home about it, only to have their families in Germany accuse them of lying or suffering from hallucinations. But idleness was not the goal. With millions of American men fighting overseas, the United States faced a severe labor shortage. The harvest needed to be brought in, trees needed to be felled, and laundry needed to be washed. The POWs became a critical part of the American wartime economy. Every morning, trucks would line up at the camp gates to take work details out into the community. This was where the real cultural collision happened. In the cotton fields of Mississippi, the cornfields of Nebraska, and the tomato canneries of Indiana, German soldiers came face to face with the American people they had been taught to hate. The propaganda had described Americans as soulless mongrels. Instead, the Germans found farmers who looked just like them, who worried about the weather and the crops just like the farmers back in Bavaria. Technically, fraternization was forbidden. The prisoners were supposed to work, eat their bag lunches, and return to the camp. But out in the vast fields of the Midwest, with only a single sleepy guard watching a dozen men, the rules blurred. At lunchtime, the farmer's wife would often invite the prisoners to the farmhouse porch. She didn't see Nazis. She saw young blonde boys who looked exactly like her own son who was fighting in the Pacific. She would bring out platters of fried chicken, pitchers of iced tea, and yes, thick, grilled steaks. There are thousands of stories of these illicit lunches. Prisoners sat at the farmer's table, struggling through broken English to show photos of their wives and children. The farmers showed photos of their sons. For a brief hour, the war evaporated. One German POW working in Minnesota recalled, "The farmer treated me like a hired hand, not an enemy. He criticized my technique with the pitchfork, not my ideology. It was the first time in 5 years I felt like a human being." These interactions did more to denazify the German soldiers than any lecture could. It is hard to maintain a belief in the racial superiority of the Aryan master race when a degenerate American farmer is feeding you steak and asking about your mother's health. However, the camps were not entirely devoid of darkness. While the Americans provided physical comfort, a vicious war for the soul of the prisoners was being fought inside the barracks. The hardcore Nazis, the SS men, and the fanatical officers tried to maintain an iron grip on the enlisted men. They set up kangaroos' courts in the latrines at night, trying and convicting fellow prisoners of defeatism or treason. If a prisoner was too friendly with the Americans, or if he spoke out against Hitler, he might be found the next morning beaten to death with a sock filled with rocks, or hanging from a rafter in a staged suicide. For a long time, the Americans were naive about this internal terror. They adhered to the military tradition of letting the German NCOs run the internal affairs of the barracks. It wasn't until a series of high-profile murders, including the hanging of a prisoner in Camp Tonkawa, Oklahoma, for the crime of writing a letter to the camp commander, that the U.S. authorities cracked down. They began to segregate the true fanatics from the regular soldiers, shipping the die-hard Nazis to high-security camps like Camp Alva in Oklahoma, dubbed the Nazi Zoo. With the fanatics removed, the re-education could truly begin. But the Americans didn't use brainwashing techniques, they used the truth. As the war in Europe crumbled and the concentration camps were liberated, the U.S. Army began to show films of the atrocities to the POWs. They herded the men into the camp theaters, expecting boredom. Then, the projectors whirred to life, showing the bulldozers pushing bodies into mass graves at Belsen and Dachau. The reaction in the camps was a mix of denial, shock, and horror. Many prisoners initially claimed it was Hollywood trickery, fake sets built to shame them. But as the footage rolled on, showing the undeniable reality of the Holocaust, the bravado crumbled. Men wept, others vomited. The silence that followed these screenings was heavy and suffocating. The myth of the clean Wehrmacht and the noble crusade of National Socialism died in the dark of those movie halls. They realized that while they were playing baseball and eating ice cream in America, their government had been industrializing murder back home. The cognitive dissonance was shattering. By May 1945, the war was over. The Third Reich had surrendered. But for the POWs in America, the journey wasn't quite finished. They were needed for the harvest. They stayed through the summer and autumn of 1945, bringing in the crops for a nation that had defeated them. But the atmosphere had changed. The fear was gone. They were just men waiting to go home. When the repatriation finally began in 1946, it was a bitter pill. They were stripped of their comfortable American uniforms and put back into their old, dyed Wehrmacht rags. They were loaded onto ships, leaving behind the land of steak and electricity. But they didn't go straight to Germany. In a final, cruel twist of geopolitics, many were transferred to French and British custody to help rebuild the shattered cities of Europe. They went from the Fritz Ritz to barely surviving in labor camps in France, clearing minefields and hauling rubble on starvation rations. It was a stark reminder that the American experience had been an anomaly, a golden interlude in a century of darkness. When they finally crossed the border into Germany in 1947 and 1948, they were strangers in their own land. They were healthy, well-fed, and carried with them suitcases filled with American cigarettes and nylon stockings, treasures in a country where the currency was worthless. They walked through the ruins of their hometowns, looking at the hollowed-out faces of their neighbors, the skeletal children playing in the rubble. They felt a profound sense of guilt. They had spent the apocalypse playing soccer and drinking beer in Texas, while their families had been buried in cellars. But they also brought something else back with them: a profound respect for democracy and the American way of life. These men, who had been the youth of the Hitler Youth, became the founding generation of West Germany. They built a new republic not on the Prussian values of militarism and obedience, but on the values they had observed in the cornfields of Iowa and the mess halls of Alabama. They remembered the farmers who treated them like men. They remembered the guards who taught them baseball. They remembered the ice cream. Years later, in the 1970s and 80s, elderly German men would often return to small towns in the American South and Midwest as tourists. They would walk into diners and general stores, looking for the places where they had been held captive. They weren't there to mourn a defeat. They were there to say, thank you. They would track down the families of the farmers they had worked for, shaking hands with the sons and daughters of the people who had fed them steak when they expected a bullet. The golden cage of the American POW camps remains one of the most fascinating paradoxes of World War II. In a conflict defined by inhumanity, by gas chambers and firebombing, the treatment of German POWs in the United States stood as a testament to a different kind of power. It proved that you can defeat an enemy with tanks and bombs, but you can only turn him into a friend with dignity, decency, and a scoop of vanilla ice cream. The German soldiers had expected to die in America. Instead, many of them admitted that it was in the prison camps of the enemy that they finally learned how to live.